thank you for the opportunity, Craig, and the Odyssey community to present and talk a little bit about what Vulcan is about. And I think there's some great opportunities to collaborate across not only what Vulcan is doing, but obviously getting some insights on what Odyssey is up to. Craig, thank you very much for that kind of whirlwind view of what's going on. It sounds like some really exciting activities underway, and it seems that certainly the Asia Pacific area is an area that Vulcan is interested in outreach, and again, opportunities for some collaboration kind of set the stage for us today. So before I do introductions, I just quickly want to run through a few topics here that we would like to bring to your attention. Certainly, I think we'd like to talk about what is HL7 or a FHIR or an accelerator, those three words, and unpacking those a little bit, and give you a little bit of context of what we're all about in the Vulcan program. Hugh is going to get a little bit into some details about how we actually work as a program, and how do we actually accelerate clinical standards, or standards, sorry, for clinical research. And then Davera, who some of you may know already, is leading one of our initiatives on FHIR to OMAP. And so we'll, describe that a little bit, what the goals are of that particular project within the whole Vulcan program. And then I want to talk a little bit about our membership and how we actually move forward as a program to meet the needs of the clinical research community for the exchange of clinical research standards. And then hopefully we'll leave enough time for some questions and answer, and maybe look to Craig to help us moderate that as far as anybody who would like to ask some questions. Before I go too much further, I would like to do some introductions. So maybe I'll ask Davera to go first, and just to introduce yourself, Davera, to the folks on the call.
Thanks, Michael. I'm Davera Gabriel. I am with Johns Hopkins University. I am the director for terminology management in our biomedical informatics and data science group. I also have some roles within HL7. I am on the terminology services management group, and I have been working in our FHIR and OMAP collaborations for the past 18 months or so.
Thank you, Davera. And Davera knows everything about the common data model, right?
No, I'm still learning a bit about that, but the great thing about Odyssey is there's lots of people to help, and we're a very collaborative group.
Thanks, Davera. Hugh Glover, would you like to introduce yourself, a little bit background?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. So as you can probably tell from the accent, I'm based in the UK, so right down in the far southwest. I've been involved with HL7 for over 20 years, so I think that makes me a veteran. Did a lot of work with the pharmacy group. I co-chair of that for several years. Then I moved across into clinical research. I've done 5 years as co-chair of the Biomedical Research and Regulation Group, which is the main work group in HL7 dealing with clinical research. And then 3 years or so ago, I got involved with Vulcan, and I'm currently the technical director for Vulcan. My background in a technical sense is originally as a developer. I still occasionally tinker at a bit of developing, try and do some example systems to try and help people understand how things might work. But I don't profess to be producing stuff to a professional level. So I'm going to talk a little bit later on about how we actually operate within Vulcan in order to bring the standards forwards and to start to think about how we implement things.
Thanks, Hugh. And just a quick background on myself, probably similar paths to Hugh in the sense of being involved with interoperability standards through HL7 for a number of years, and both in Canada, US, and abroad for us, for myself, sorry. Overlap with Hugh at one point around the pharmacy standards development, but also electronic health claims, health surveillance, and other areas within the clinical domain. So with those introductions, let's just move into kind of the first agenda topic, which is to give you a sense of why Vulcan is around, what is Vulcan, and what is HL7 FHIR. This slide to me really speaks to why we need to work with our clinical care team when we're talking about clinical research. So if I'm looking back, like Hugh, for the last 20 plus years in interoperability and exchanging of clinical data, that's where the focus has been for a large number of standards developers. So they would be working on how to exchange lab data, pharmacy data, patient administration stuff, et cetera. And certainly a large focus has been in that area. But exchanging data for clinical research purposes has really kind of lagged behind as far as a focus for the standards community. One could call it a secondary use, if you will, but the way we see this working together is that we know that clinical care is likely a key input into developing research theories and thesis and protocols. And that research then obviously informs clinical care. So we need to work harmoniously with the clinical care community in order to support the clinical research community appropriately. And what we're focusing here is on data, and basically a data model, if you will, but packaging that data in such a way that it supports the exchange of information between different trading partners, whether that's an electronic health record system, whether that's a protocol sponsor, a site, or a regulatory agency. So all that research data has to flow from point to point, and I think what we'll continue to talk about here is we're focused on clinical research use cases for data in transit. And we look at, when we work with our research partners, for data at rest to OMAP. Certainly that is the preeminent standard that we understand around how that data will be used by the research community once it arrives at a destination. The good news for us is that a lot of the data that's used in clinical care, we want to leverage that and put that into the clinical research context. So when we're identifying individual patient data or individual clinical events that support a research study or a drug protocol, for example, we already have that data defined through other standards that are used through organizations such as HL7 and, of course, OMAP. And we want to be able to transfer that information in those data standards, so that when somebody does receive the data, they will receive that data in a standardized form and format. So Vulcan essentially grew out of a need in September of 2019, or beyond, slightly before that. I think Hugh was instrumental in actually basically bringing people together at the end of one of the HL7 working group meetings in September in Atlanta, and these people just met based on word of mouth during the working group meeting and said, yes, we absolutely have to have a project that is really dealing with the clinical research interoperability standards space. So this is the initial group that met in September 2019, pre-pandemic, and interestingly, it wasn't until just this past year that we've actually started to meet in person in a couple of venues I'll describe a little later. The group essentially formed into the early part of 2020 and brought together a number of different, I'll say, convening members to basically draw the blueprint for the Vulcan program. It is part of an HL7 Accelerator program, which I'll describe in just a moment. It's one of many accelerators that HL7 has created, but it is really trying to find a balanced perspective on supporting the exchange of data for clinical research. So that includes standards development organizations. It includes obviously government agencies and regulators, patients, academia, technology vendors, and industry groups. So Vulcan, I think, is fairly unique in bringing all these groups together under one umbrella, and really with I'll say, a global focus. So this is not intended to be a US only or Europe only set of standards that are being developed through the accelerator. This is intended to be a cross section of around the world, global set of standards for clinical research exchange. So this group, while some of them are obviously based in certain geographies, they're just the convening groups. We are currently around 43 members as a program. I'll just leave this slide on the screen for a moment. But a broad representation across those various 6 perspectives from the previous slide, all contributing towards a set of standards that will, again, help the research community and inform clinical care. I mentioned earlier that Vulcan is one of many accelerators that HL7 has created. So the accelerator program really looks at, I'll say, gaps in the interoperability standards in the health space. And so they have specific focuses. For example, ours is on clinical research, Helios is on public health, and Codex on cancer care and cancer research. So each of these accelerators is intended to put a focus from the HL7 standards community in the development of HL7 FHIR standards. And FHIR is just the most recent iteration of exchange standards from HL7. And part of the reason for the program, or one of the justifications for the program is, and this may happen in Odyssey as well, but certainly, standards development can take a very non-straightforward route from idea to final standard or implemented standard, and circuitous route. It could take an indeterminable amount of time, and so the programs here that you see on this screen are intended to really put a focus and put a structure around developing standards. So Hugh and I are part of the Vulcan PMO. And it's our job to orchestrate, if you will, the development of those standards within Vulcan. There are another set of 7 other accelerators that you see on the screen, again, with their different focuses. But the idea is to make the development of standards more predictable. So one of the things that we wanted to do within the Vulcan, I guess the vision of Vulcan is really kind of bring people together and identify how we can actually use something like HL7 FHIR to exchange data and support the research community and inform clinical care. So we accomplish that by bridging those existing gaps, connecting the collaborations around the world. We work and harmonize with others. And that's one of the purposes, I think, of having this call today, is to kind of, continue the a good work through the memorandum of understanding between HL7 and Odyssey, but specifically as it relates to our remit. And also, like I said, maximize collective resources and deliver some tools and solutions. We are quite proud of the fact that we've actually created that community of interested parties. And that community is really there to actually build standards that are devoid of organizational bias or commercial interest. So we want to, continue that process moving forward, and I think we've done a great job moving that yardstick forward and creating that community within Vulcan. I think I touched on some of this, but these are the primary goals of Vulcan. I will say that one of the things I like is maximizing collective resources. So we all have similar problems in our own organizations on how to exchange data in clinical research. And so being able to collaborate and use the power of many to solve these problems is I think, one of the key hallmarks of Vulcan. So Vulcan is why would someone be interested in Vulcan as a program, as an organization that's conducting or participating in clinical research? Again, things such as reducing costs. So using a standard versus building something and doing a site-by-site negotiation obviously reduces cost. Removing barriers, finding common methods to dealing with privacy consent and inconsistent data can be done through the power of many. We believe that being part of Vulcan can help increase quality of clinical research because we're using things such as standardized terminologies to reduce ambiguity. So basically talking the same language. We also believe that within Vulcan, building that network so that there are collaborators, much like in Odyssey, to share lessons learned and be better together. The power of many, I can't speak highly enough of, but basically crowdsourcing solutions that have been plagued, the research community for a long time. And again, that speaks to quality of data, reducing costs, et cetera. And then I think the focus for today, at least for me, and I hope the whole Vulcan program, is how do we actually start harmonize standards? I'm a big advocate of harmonizing versus creating new and more. And Vulcan as a whole is really trying to leverage existing stuff. So, for example, OMAP does resolve a major issue for people who want to build, clinical research repositories or data warehouses or the like, at least my understanding. But Vulcan fills the void, we believe, in actually getting that data there in a consistent and a structured format, working with partners such as EHR vendors to give them real-world data using an HL7 FHIR standard that Vulcan has built. We have a number of different projects underway within Vulcan, the program itself. Schedule activities looking at how to actually describe the protocol and the sets of activities for making sure that patients are following the protocol. Real world data, essentially 2 use cases within that to look at how to identify cohorts of patients that are forming part of a study, and then extracting that data in a structured format. You can well imagine that every EHR, whether it's an Epic system or a Cerner system or the like, look at data in a slightly different form. This is a mechanism to get that data out in a structured and a consistent form. Phenotypic data, looking at the human genome and extracting that information to support genomic research. Our electronic product information based out of a project in Europe, common structure for drug products. Adverse events, looking at those primarily through a research lens. So those events that might arise from an adverse drug event during a drug protocol or et cetera. And then I think I'm going to leave Davera to talk about our FHIR to OMAP project in a moment when she presents her slides. Just want to also let you know that within Vulcan, we are looking at additional projects, our sample data, basically to look at some synthetic, some anonymized data, and that will support the development of the standards and the testing of those standards. A MedWatch, the FDA MedWatch form, so adverse event reporting, so we're looking at that as well. And then the most recent one that I think is building steam is with ICH C#, the digital protocol between regulators and a sponsor and the regulator. So those are the major initiatives that are coming down the pipe really quickly. I think my last slide here is at the end of 2022, we put this slide together really talking about where the program is as a whole. We've spent basically 2.5 years at that point building the foundation. So we do have implementation guides that Hugh will talk about that describe real-world data, schedule activities, and electronic product information. We have actually participated through connectathons to test those implementation guides or standards. And we've set up the proper, what we believe is the proper governance, membership, and financial models. But as we go forward as an accelerator, three major focuses for the program. And it probably should say continue to go global. We are looking at external outreach beyond our traditional, I'll say, US focused groups, or at least US I won't say US focused, but certainly the majority of our participants in the past have been in the US. We recently, in March, held our first equivalent to a symposium, Euro Vulcan, in March in Paris, with great success, and we look to Asia Pacific for our next venue for that. We are also focusing on implementation. Standards are great unless they're implemented, they are a paper exercise. So we do need to move towards implementation. We have a number of initiatives underway for that. And then we are looking at new content, which you saw on the previous slide. So at this point, hopefully you're collecting some questions. I want to make sure that we get through our slides and have that dialogue. So with that, I will pass the baton on to Hugh, and I'm happy to forward your slides, Hugh, if you wish.
Yep, that'll be fine. Thank you, Michael. So I'm going to scamper through this set of slides fairly quickly. There is lots of stuff we can talk about how we work, but I really just want to give you the very high level view of that. So if we start in this one in the bottom left hand corner, you'll see a picture there that Michael had on one of his slides. It's the different groups that we draw our membership from. So SDOs, yes. Industry, yes. Government agencies, yes. But also technology vendors, patients, research within academia. So we have a very wide base that we draw from. From within that base, we've then got a number of groupings that manage it all through. So an advisory council and a steering committee. And then everybody who joins Vulcan becomes part of the operations committee. And the operations committee is the main working part of the group. And from within that, we then draw a number of project teams to actually deliver a project. And then we get the red bits on this. So some of the project teams you'll see have got the Cape Crusader on there, who is the funded technical support to actually help projects go through. And as Michael said, it's one of the things that accelerators are able to do, is to manage projects and actually get the standards development to happen in a timely fashion. Whereas the volunteer market has, yes, it gets stuff done, but it sometimes takes rather longer than you would wish when you're trying to run a committee for doing something. Right in the centre, there's the other red blob. That's Michael and I and Shani and Stacey, who are our other members of the project management office. And we have responsibility for running all the background systems and the elements that go on. So with a coordination and management piece. So the next slide, please, Michael. So our projects that we gather, we started off with a huge list of projects. We had over 30 different use cases people suggested. We whittled that down, and we now have a more formal process for taking a use case submission. Anybody who wants to suggest something Vulcan should look at is very welcome to do so. Whether you're part of Vulcan or not, we will still take that seriously. So if you go to our friends at Google and do a search for Vulcan use case submission, you'll get delivered to this form. Put in the very simple details that it asks, and that will trigger off the process. We will then run through an evaluation to see whether this constitutes a project that we've already worked on, or something that we ought to bring into the fold of what Vulcan is working on, and take it through the governance process. So the next slide, please. The core working activity within Vulcan is the Connectathon. HL7 itself holds connectathons 3 times a year, so September, January and May. And in order to have content for a connectathon, there's really a run up to that of something like 4 or 5 months. When we're running projects, we try to do things on a short cycle. We don't really want to take on projects that are going to take 10 years to come to fruition. It's too difficult. It doesn't show a return. It doesn't meet the objectives that we have. What we really like are things where we can show measurable progress from one connectathon to the next. So we start from a set of priorities established through the operations and steering committees. That leads us into what our connectathon is going to do. We find a set of participants for that, do the development work to it, run the connectathon itself, learn the lessons, and then reevaluate the priorities. Maybe we go around the same loop a second time, maybe not, maybe we're going to do something different. So we have that cycle of repeated development and incremental development. The next slide, please. So that fits into this overall project evolution process, where we start with ideas that have come in as use cases, run them through the proposal and discovery processes before we get into development. So once you're into development is really where that connectathon cycle starts churning its way around. And you can see from this where we are with the different projects. The phenotypic data project is really still in its early stages of establishing what it's doing. FHIR to OMAP and adverse events projects are working their way through their development, whereas real world data, schedule activities and electronic product information are all at the level in which they're now starting to publish things. So next slide, please. So those processes that we were just looking at, some of those are driven by our own internal Vulcan process, but we're obviously also entirely dependent on the wider HL7 process. And the end point for that, for the majority of our projects, will be production of a balloted implementation guide. So an implementation guide is saying how, for a specific use case, you make use of the various building bricks of the HL7 standard in order to meet and produce something that will actually work. So these are the 3 projects we've talked about: schedule activities, electronic product information, real world data. First and last of those are now balloted and published. The EPI one in the middle is probably a week or maybe 2 weeks away from being published. Again, there's search links in there, or when you get the slides, there's actually a link in there that you can follow through. Next slide, please. So all of these have worked through the connectathon cycle. This is just plucked from January of this year. We had 4 tracks running at that point. We had applications running within those. We were updating those, making sure that the content of the implementation guide actually made sense with those applications. For some of them, we were doing more in the way of education, early stages of things. How are we going to tackle this? What particular issues are there? But always focused on getting sets of people together. Next slide, please. And if you've not been to one of the HL7 connectathons, it is a major event. Anything up to 500 people present, anything up to 40 different connectathon tracks, people sitting at tables doing a whole chunk of development work. Again, this is the groups from January, and as you can see, it occasionally gets slightly frivolous when people get the silly hats out. The next slide, please. So we've been running connectathons now since January 2021. We got started really as soon as Vulcan was up and functioning. And up to January of this year, we'd run 7 events, 7 topics, 24 tracks. Those numbers have all increased since then, but the normal practice is running multiple tracks on each occasion. And we are now starting to look at running our own connectathons separate from the standard HL7 ones, just to meet the requirements of our developers. It's not always feasible for people to go to a particular event. The timing doesn't always work. We don't want to tie people having to go off and do something, but let them work in a way that's most convenient. And then my last slide, please. And if you can advance this one as well, Michael. Thank you. So the ideas through to publishing, you've seen before, that's what we've been working at. We do want to start looking more at the way in which projects get adopted. It's all very well producing an implementation guide. You actually need to know that what you've written in that does work, does make sense. There are bound to be things that aren't quite right that need redoing. So we need that feedback loop. And it's one of the areas we're working at the moment, is how we bring that adoption and feedback loop back into our overall development process. With that, I think that was my last slide, and I can hand over to Davera.
Great. Thank you so much, Hugh. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk briefly about a sister activity to our Odyssey, OMAP, and FHIR working group. I'm going to talk about some of the attributes of the Vulcan FHIR to OMAP project to provide an example that's maybe something a little more that's on the ground that you all can relate to show how a Vulcan project works in the context of scope that of work that you're familiar with. So the Vulcan FHIR Accelerator is achieving enormous strides developing focused utilization of FHIR in many key translational research areas. However, the FHIR community does not have the same data harmonization and data quality analysis capabilities for observational data that the Odyssey community has developed and deployed at scale. The Odyssey community, working in tandem with the strength that FHIR brings to the table, creates a great cross-pollinating win-win scenario. As Michael stated, a unique strength that the Vulcan community brings to all of its projects is its diverse membership with representation from international, academic, commercial, payer, and government organizations. Projects of interest to Vulcan, including the FHIR to OMAP project, must meet certain criteria, especially projects that link clinical care to clinical research. So the Vulcan FHIR to OMAP project aligns these key criteria required by Vulcan in its unique bridging existing gaps, strategically connecting stakeholders, all of you with the FHIR community, creating high-value collaborations, maximizing available resources, and delivering integrated tools and solutions. So Vulcan's role in all of this effort is as a coordinating body, a strategic consolidator of effort, and a use case mediator, maximizing the value to the broadest possible international translational research constituency. The FHIR to OMAP project's value is through solidifying a canonical set of standard high-value maps from FHIR to OMAP. Numerous prior OMAP and FHIR transformation projects have aimed to address the needs of one or two types of organizations and are typically focused in a single or a couple of clinical domains. It's important to keep in mind that transformations between OMAP and FHIR are numerous, variable, and expensive to create de novo. But a well-vetted common core set of FHIR to OMAP maps would reduce the cost, increase the speed of ETL procedures for individual organizations, and a stable, reliable set of maps can support generation of transformed data that are comparable and consistent and support reliability of data and reproducible research results on OMAP-based analytic tools. Furthermore, standard maps also create the foundation for automation of FHIR to OMAP transformations in the future. Next slide, please. So I want to be sure to emphasize some key characteristics about the Vulcan FHIR to OMAP project. First of all, the project is unidirectional, focused only on FHIR to OMAP transformations. The project will review and leverage prior work and only generate new maps when these are otherwise unavailable. The project scope is limited to highly utilized standards for EHR data, focused on a common core, as expressed in the HL7 US Core, International Patient Summary, and International Patient Access implementation guides. The map review and curation process we think of as a systematic review of maps, and that results in a canonical set of maps from FHIR to OMAP for the common core EHR data elements. Additionally, the project will be reporting the results of the environmental scan conducted to identify prior work. And like other Vulcan projects, the maps set developed as a result of the project will be validated in test procedures and iterative connectathon engagement. So to summarize, the approach of comparing and enhancing prior work to develop standard OMAP transformations scoped to highly available EHR data on FHIR maximizes the effectiveness of the Vulcan resource investment. It's complementary to the Odyssey, OMAP, and FHIR working group aspirations, and it is of strategic importance to the international research community. So I'll turn it back over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Davera. And with that, hopefully we've kind of come a little bit full circle on what the program is all about, how we work as an accelerator, and I think the open door to how we want to work with Odyssey on the FHIR to OMAP project. So I'm just going to do a couple of slides and then quickly move to our questions and answers session. Just wanted to also provide a small insight into some of the events and educational opportunities that we host within the Vulcan community. Obviously, at various conferences, we had Vulcan I mentioned in March, a 2-day conference and connectathon. We have connectathons either through the HL7 3 times a year, as Hugh mentioned, and optionally, and I think, sorry, and our second Vulcan connectathon will likely also be hosted in October. So we have hosted roundtables with various industry players to basically look at how we can collaborate and work together, and that actually helped to create the Adverse Event Project within Vulcan. On the member side, we host Vulcan 101 sessions, which is kind of a deeper dive for members to better understand what Vulcan is trying to do. Many people have people who participate in Vulcan, but this is an opportunity for a broader perspective within those organizations to get access to deep knowledge about what Vulcan is trying to do. And then we also provide an opportunity for our members to showcase what they're doing to other members. Sounds like there's some similar activities in Odyssey as well. And that's an opportunity where we get the closest probably to commercial interests within Vulcan, because we do look at commercial products through our members at that point. I throw up our membership model just to give you an idea that we have a combination of paid memberships, basically for the for-profit organizations that join Vulcan, and the nonprofit ones, government agencies and consortia or associations join without a fee. In our members, we want to make sure that everyone is active. So when I showed you that slide of 40-odd members, they all are contributing in-kind hours in addition to any fees that may be applicable. And those are the metrics, the targets that we have for each of our members. And then they are offered certain benefits through that. We continue to grow as a program. We would certainly welcome additional membership that would continue to expand, the breadth of reach for Vulcan around the globe into various other sectors of clinical research. And so, if you have that requirement or desire or interest in membership, and I'll leave this slide here while we entertain questions. Please feel free to reach out. The email address is probably one of the easiest ways to get hold of us. sending an email to that address will get you further information about Vulcan. And Craig, I think hopefully we've given enough time for some questions from those who are participating today.
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for joining and presenting. We do have like 7 minutes. I know Andrew had one in the chat that was just answered a bit by Davera, but Andrew, do you want to, or is there, maybe let's just do, if anyone has a question, maybe just raise your hand and we will go from there. Paul, go ahead.
Hey, thank you for that presentation. I'm certainly interested and excited to see FHIR develop to be a way of exchanging data. I guess today with Odyssey, we are moving, on a regular basis, millions of patients with billions of objects, say on a monthly basis. And so I'm wondering, how are you envisioning the protocoling of that to be taking place? Right now, it's all done in mostly data orchestration tools. And so is that, and I know you've been working on FHIR bundles, but I'm interested to see, is that evolving for us to be able to do large scale data analytics work?
Okay. Hugh, I'm hoping you can answer that one a little bit more. It sounds a little more technical than me.
Yeah, I think that's a question that in one sense is not a Vulcan question. I mean, clearly it's something that is a concern within the domain as a whole. But in looking at things that are running at scale, there is a separate FHIR accelerator, the FHIR at scale, which comes out as fast. And we would aim to take their guidance and their content from the scale perspective. So there's no point in Vulcan going out and reinventing any wheels. If somebody else is already doing something, we'd always point them at that and try and make use of that. We don't try and do stuff that somebody else is already doing.
Another example of that, Hugh, if I'm correct, is looking at the fast HL7 Accelerator, and also for consent and other aspects as well. So,
exactly.
Again,
exactly.
Not solving it within Vulcan, but saying, hey, we're going to leverage and collaborate with the FAST program for that.
That was great. Thank you for pointing me to FAST. I did have a second question, which is a little unrelated to the data transfer. Is that so when we transfer data into the OMAP data model, we have to do a lot of data quality transformations and resource constraints. And so we have over typically 60,000 concepts covering drugs and procedures and labs and diagnosis codes. And right now, there are great observations within FHIR, but there are very few resource profiles to constrain individual concepts. And so how do we, on one hand, I've got 60,000 concepts in Odyssey, and I have a handful of concepts in FHIR that actually have data constraints on them. And so I'm wondering, how are you going to help us bridge that? So if we can use FHIR as a source for OMAP, we have to solve this massive gap in resource profiles for data constraints. Is that something the FHIR Accelerator for Vulcan is working on?
No, but it could be, I think is the quick answer. It's where that form for submitting use cases really comes into its own. If that's something that we seriously need to work on, then I'd be interested to see a use case to cover that being put in there. But Davera, that sounds like this is also part of your expertise.
Well, Paul, I listened carefully to what you said, and then I also kind of am aware of where you're currently working. Do you mean, and maybe this is a longer conversation, but if you're talking about concepts, like coded concepts, are you talking about like device data and image data and other kinds of data?
I'm talking about A1C in FHIR is an observation. It is one of the ONC core profiles, which is great. We have 60,000 different concepts like A1C. And so we would need to have 60,000 resource profile constraints in FHIR to be able to get a data set in OMAP of the same quality that we're currently getting out of the backend analytics platforms.
Okay. So now thank you for repeating that. So one of the things that's happening with the data quality use case, and that you guys will probably hear more about when the Ben Hamlin from the NCQA presents in this meeting in a couple of weeks, is that there is some OMAP and FHIR activities, exchange of data activities happening around the quality measurement use cases. In those scenarios, there will be, we will be developing, and what will come out of that work will be ways to go between FHIR CQL definitions for certain, measurements for certain clinical phenomenon over into OMAP, and then the reverse back over into FHIR. In the process of supporting that particular use case, we will need to develop mechanisms such as you suggest. On the individual concept level, and in terms of doing concept and vocabulary management, just very recently, we've been working with the Terminology Infrastructure Group at HL7, and Graham Grieve is developing and has provided a proposal about how to put the OMAP vocabulary on FHIR. So in terms of going from OMAP to FHIR, having that a set of standards in place, or that approach in place as a standard way to go from OMAP to FHIR will also support the kinds of things that you're speaking about. So I don't know if that's helpful, but there's some things that are kind of on the horizon and in process in terms of the broader OMAP and FHIR collaboration that I think will support what you're asking about. And Paul, what I would like to do is really work more closely with you to see if there aren't nuances to the observations and the kinds of needs that you are suggesting that could be brought to the work, either in the the quality measurement scenarios,
Yes.
as well as the vocabulary exchange.
Davera, I know we're out of time, but I do think that CQL to CIRSE is the fantastic translation of expression between Odyssey logic and FHIR logic. It doesn't get around that at the base of it, FHIR needs to have a profile for constraining its resources, and it has very few of them, and it hasn't been scaling up over the past several years. And so I'm wondering how we're going to address that data quality gap. But thank you.
Let's work together to and make sure that we capture your observations and what your needs are as a community member. And working with Vulcan is a perfect place to get some really focused attention on really specific needs like that.